The Eastern Front of early 1944 was a landscape reshaped by months of brutal combat and sweeping Soviet advances. Following the decisive victory at the Battle of Kursk in mid-1943 and the subsequent Lower Dnieper offensive, the Red Army was poised to launch a massive coordinated operation to push German forces westward across Ukraine and toward the Carpathian Mountains. This undertaking, later named the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, would become one of the most extensive and strategically significant operations of World War II, involving over 2.3 million Soviet troops and spanning hundreds of kilometers along the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The strategic objective of the offensive was to liberate right-bank Ukraine, a vast and agriculturally vital region stretching from the Dnieper River to the foothills of the Carpathians. This included major urban centers such as Kirovohrad, Nikopol, Kryvyi Rog, and ultimately Odessa and the approaches to the Romanian border. From the Soviet perspective, success in this offensive would not only restore vital territory to the USSR, but would also serve to destroy Army Group South, one of Germany's key strategic formations, thus opening the path for subsequent offensives into the Balkans. In early January 1944, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, initiated a series of operations under the broader umbrella of the Dnieper-Carpathian Campaign. These were not a single unified push, but a complex sequence of interconnected offensives launched by multiple fronts. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts, each commanding hundreds of thousands of troops. These fronts were supported by dozens of rifle divisions, tank corps, artillery brigades, and air armies, all operating in coordination across a diverse and difficult terrain that ranged from frozen steppe to swampy river valleys and mountainous forest land. The operational plan was ambitious. It required Soviet forces to punch through well-entrenched German positions, cross several major rivers under fire, and advance through areas heavily mined and fortified by retreating Wehrmacht units. German forces, primarily under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South, were reeling from earlier defeats, but were still capable of organized resistance. They had prepared strong defensive positions along key river lines, such as the Inhul, Southern Bug, and Dniester, attempting to delay the Soviet advance long enough for reinforcements or counterattacks. In contrast to earlier Soviet offensives that often emphasized brute force and costly frontal assaults, the Dnieper-Carpathian Campaign demonstrated a maturing Red Army increasingly adept at conducting deep operations, rapid encirclements, and coordination across multiple axes. Stavka's operational doctrine now prioritized flexibility, speed, and the exploitation of tactical breakthroughs. The result was a series of fluid battles where whole German corps found themselves encircled or forced into precipitous retreats, abandoning equipment and wounded in the process. By the end of January, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Vatutin launched its assault toward the city of Korsun, setting the stage for one of the most pivotal episodes of the campaign. Meanwhile, the Third Ukrainian Front under General Malinovsky pushed toward Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, areas of critical importance to the German war economy due to their manganese and iron ore deposits. Simultaneously, the Second Ukrainian Front under Konev moved toward Kirovohrad, targeting the junction of German defensive lines and seeking to collapse the central axis of resistance. The scale of movement, supply, and coordination required for such simultaneous operations was staggering. Soviet logistical planning had improved markedly since the early war years. Thousands of railway workers restored lines behind the front, while military engineers bridged rivers and cleared mines in freezing conditions. Supplies were trucked in over hastily repaired roads or sledged across ice when necessary. Despite these advancements, Red Army soldiers still endured extreme hardship. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion were common. Yet morale was high. Victory after Stalingrad and Kursk had given the Soviet soldier a sense of momentum and inevitability that fed their resolve. As the offensive gathered pace, its impact began to reach beyond the battlefield. Civilians in the path of the advancing Red Army experienced liberation mixed with fear. Many had lived under brutal German occupation regimes, where forced labor, reprisal killings, and mass deportations were common. Yet Soviet authority brought its own set of traumas, NKVD units arrived close behind the front lines, often arresting those suspected of collaboration or disloyalty. Villages caught between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets frequently suffered looting, destruction, and reprisals from both sides. The long-occupied towns and cities bore the scars of forced occupation and were often reduced to rubble before being retaken. Internationally, the offensive had significant implications. The collapse of German positions in Ukraine signaled to Allied powers the deepening crisis facing Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. It reinforced the pressure on Western leaders to hasten preparations for a second front in France, which would later become Operation Overlord. In Berlin, the rapid Soviet gains sowed discontent within the Wehrmacht High Command and further strained Hitler's micromanagement of military operations. His refusal to authorize timely withdrawals often led to the encirclement and destruction of German formations that might otherwise have escaped. What unfolded over the coming weeks would confirm that the Red Army's advance through Ukraine was not merely a tactical series of victories, but a strategic unraveling of German control in the south. From encirclements at Korsun and Kamenets-Podolsky to the liberation of Odessa and the crossing into Romanian-held territory, the campaign would alter the political and military landscape of Eastern Europe and lay the foundation for the final Soviet drives toward Central Europe. As Soviet forces intensified their pressure across the southern front, one of the earliest and most strategically significant operations unfolded at the bend of the Dnieper River, near the towns of Zvenihorodka and Korsun-Shevchenkivsky. This operation, later known as the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky Offensive, would come to epitomize the Red Army's growing mastery of deep encirclement tactics. It was a calculated effort by the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts to surround and destroy a large pocket of German forces positioned in a salient formed by the river's curve. Soviet High Command envisioned the operation as a southern echo of Stalingrad, an opportunity to annihilate multiple German divisions and create a breach in the central axis of Army Group South's defenses. By late January 1944, Soviet spearheads began converging from north and south in a pincer movement designed to trap the German Alaudalan and Sun Army Corps, totaling nearly 60,000 troops. Despite harsh winter conditions and treacherous terrain, the Soviets executed a rapid and coordinated advance, encircling the German forces in the area by early February. Unlike the situation at Stalingrad, however, the Germans had learned from past mistakes and were determined to prevent another catastrophic loss. Reinforcements were dispatched to break the encirclement, and efforts to create a relief corridor began almost immediately. Inside the Korsun pocket, German troops faced bleak prospects. Supplies were limited, ammunition dwindled, and the bitter cold hampered both defense and mobility. Luftwaffe transport planes attempted to supply the encircled troops from the air, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire and poor weather often made deliveries ineffective. Meanwhile, Red Army artillery pounded the perimeter relentlessly, and probing attacks sought to tighten the noose. The Soviet goal was clear: crush the encircled forces before they could escape or be rescued. The breakout attempt by the German forces came on the night of February 16, 17, under cover of darkness and heavy snow. Led by remnants of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking and elements of the 1st Panzer Division, the Germans launched a desperate assault westward through Soviet lines in an attempt to link up with relief forces. The breakout partially succeeded. Approximately 30,000 men managed to escape, but it came at enormous cost. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Most of the heavy equipment was abandoned or destroyed, and the coherence of German defense in the region was shattered. The Soviets swiftly mopped up remaining resistance and secured the battlefield. The Korsun operation, while not as decisive as hoped, was nonetheless a major psychological and strategic victory for the Red Army. It showcased their improved ability to coordinate large mechanized formations across multiple fronts, and it demonstrated their growing logistical resilience in winter warfare. For the German Wehrmacht, it confirmed the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front and the inability of their command structure to adapt effectively to Soviet tactics. As the Soviets pressed westward, further operations unfolded across the southern reaches of Ukraine. The Third Ukrainian Front launched its assault on Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, areas whose manganese and iron ore reserves had long been critical to the German war industry. The Germans, aware of the importance of these resources, had transformed the Nikopol bridgehead into a heavily fortified zone. However, a series of coordinated assaults, beginning in late January and continuing into February, gradually dislodged the defenders. Soviet engineers bridged rivers under fire, sappers cleared dense minefields, and tank units spearheaded breakthroughs in narrow corridors of open terrain. By mid-February, Nikopol had fallen, and by the end of the month, Soviet troops had taken Krivoy Rog. These victories not only deprived the Germans of key industrial assets, but also collapsed their defensive line along the lower Dnieper, forcing further withdrawals toward Mykolaiv and the southern Bug. The Red Army was now operating in territory that had been under German occupation since 1941. Villages and cities once central to the German exploitation of Ukrainian agriculture and labor were being retaken, often amid scenes of devastation. Scorched earth policies, combined with years of neglect and punitive occupation measures, had left much of the countryside in ruins. Simultaneously, in the central sector of the offensive, the Second Ukrainian Front under General Ivan Konev initiated the Kirovograd offensive. This operation, conducted in January, sought to destroy German defensive concentrations around the city of Kirovograd and to break through toward the southern Bug. Konev's forces, employing combined arms tactics with close air support and massed artillery, achieved a breakthrough and rapidly encircled elements of the German Eighth Army. Although some German units managed to retreat, the Soviet advance succeeded in forcing a major reorientation of Axis lines, weakening the central anchor of the Southern Front. By March 1944, the cumulative effect of these offensives had irreparably damaged Army Group South. The German front line was broken into disconnected fragments, with entire corps retreating in disorder or collapsing under pressure. Soviet commanders seized the initiative and launched pursuit operations, designed to prevent the Germans from establishing new defensive lines. In places such as Uman, Vinnytsia, and the approaches to the Dniester River, mobile Soviet units harassed retreating German columns, captured supply depots, and pushed beyond logistical expectations. At the same time, Soviet partisan activity behind enemy lines had reached unprecedented levels. Operating in the forests and swamps of western Ukraine and Belarus, partisans conducted sabotage missions that targeted railways, bridges, and communications infrastructure, further impeding the German retreat and disrupting efforts to reinforce threatened sectors. These efforts were closely coordinated with frontline operations, demonstrating the increasing integration of partisan warfare into overall Soviet military planning. As the Red Army advanced, it encountered mixed reactions from local populations. Some Ukrainians, particularly those who had suffered under German occupation or who had supported Soviet partisans, welcomed the liberators. Others, especially in Western regions with strong nationalist sentiments, viewed both Germans and Soviets as occupiers and resisted both. The NKVD followed closely behind the Red Army, conducting mass arrests, screening civilians, and reasserting control over areas that had experienced a degree of independence or alternative administration during the occupation. The operational tempo of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive accelerated as Soviet commanders recognized that German forces lacked the cohesion and reserves necessary to mount effective counteroffensives. What had begun as a regional campaign was now evolving into a strategic breakthrough that threatened to unravel the entire German position in southeastern Europe. By early March 1944, the Soviet advance had transformed into a sweeping series of maneuvers that bypassed fortified strongpoints and focused on disrupting German operational depth. The collapse of the Nikopol bridgehead and the fall of Krivoy Rog left the German Sixth Army and neighboring formations exposed on extended, poorly supported fronts. In response, the Soviet High Command approved a series of follow-up operations designed to exploit the momentum: the Berezhnegovatoye-Snigirevka and Odessa offensives, both spearheaded by the Third Ukrainian Front under General Rodion Malinovsky. The Berezhnegovatoye-Snigirevka offensive, launched in mid-March, targeted German positions along the southern Bug River and sought to outflank Mykolaiv. Despite stiff resistance and the challenging terrain of early spring, where thawing ground created swamps and impassable mud, the Red Army used rapid crossings, mobile artillery, and concentrated tank strikes to penetrate Axis lines. The German Sixth Army, still recovering from earlier defeats, could no longer sustain coherent defensive operations. Soviet forces exploited the disarray, enveloping and routing large enemy elements near Voznesensk, cutting communications between German corps, and pushing the front line toward the Black Sea. Soon after, attention shifted to the major Black Sea port of Odessa. The city, occupied since 1941, was both a strategic stronghold and a symbol of Soviet resistance during the early months of the war. Its capture was not only a logistical priority but also a political and psychological objective. The Soviet plan involved a multi-pronged assault by the Third Ukrainian Front with amphibious and airborne elements in reserve. Between late March and early April, as German and Romanian forces scrambled to hold the approaches, Soviet units broke through at multiple points along the Dniester River and bypassed the city's outer defenses. On April 10, 1944, Soviet troops entered Odessa. German and Romanian forces had evacuated under cover of night, leaving behind equipment and wounded. The fall of the city marked the end of a major phase in the offensive and severed the Axis connection to key supply routes in the south. It also opened the door to Soviet advances into Bessarabia and the Balkans. With Odessa secured, the Soviet Union regained a critical naval hub and port infrastructure, allowing for future operations along the western Black Sea coast. Meanwhile, further north, one of the most dramatic and tactically complex operations of the entire offensive was unfolding: the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Zhukov and the Second Ukrainian Front under Konev coordinated a massive pincer movement against the German First Panzer Army, commanded by General Hans Valentin Hube. The goal was to encircle and destroy the Panzer Army in western Ukraine near the city of Kamenets-Podolsky and sever its access to Romania and Hungary. The encirclement was completed by late March, trapping over 200,000 German troops. However, unlike the Korsun Pocket, the Germans were able to maintain operational discipline and exploit Soviet overextension. Hube's forces launched a grueling fighting retreat through forested terrain, muddy fields, and crumbling villages. Constant Soviet attacks, air raids, and partisan harassment inflicted heavy losses, but the Germans broke through toward German-held territory by mid-April. Although a large portion of the Panzer Army escaped destruction, it came at the cost of nearly all their heavy equipment, thousands of casualties, and the permanent loss of their eastern Ukrainian positions. The Kamenets-Podolsky operation exposed the increasing tension between Soviet tactical success and logistical limitations. Soviet supply lines were stretched over hundreds of kilometers of devastated infrastructure. Roads were reduced to mud during the Rasputitsa, spring thaw, delaying fuel and ammunition shipments. Railway lines lagged behind the pace of the advance, requiring engineers to rebuild bridges and tracks constantly. Nevertheless, the Soviets adapted by using horse-drawn transport, captured German vehicles, and temporary depots, sustaining a level of mobility that allowed the offensive to continue. The cumulative pressure on the German Army Group South forced a major reorganization. In April, Adolf Hitler ordered the division of the formation into Army Groups North Ukraine and South Ukraine, a nominal gesture meant to preserve control and morale amid growing chaos. Field commanders, already exasperated by Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals or strategic retreats, faced mounting losses, desertions, and breakdowns in command cohesion. The Wehrmacht's ability to hold the Dniester line eroded quickly as Red Army units crossed the river and began probing the Carpathian foothills. While military operations continued at high tempo, the political landscape shifted in tandem. The liberation of Ukraine provided the Soviet regime with new leverage to consolidate post-war control. NKVD and SMERSH units initiated widespread purges of local administrations and re-established the Soviet administrative apparatus. Collaborators, real or perceived, were arrested by the tens of thousands. Property was confiscated, agricultural collectives were reformed, and wartime resistance movements, especially Ukrainian nationalist groups like the UPA, became primary targets of Soviet repression. For the civilians of southern and western Ukraine, the return of Soviet rule was a complex experience. Some viewed it as liberation, others as the resumption of oppression. Entire towns bore witness to the scars of war, homes destroyed, cemeteries filled with mass graves, populations displaced. The agricultural heartland of the region was in ruins, and famine loomed due to disrupted planting and distribution. Soviet propaganda, however, framed the offensive as both vengeance and redemption, a final reclaiming of Ukraine as an inseparable part of the Soviet homeland. At the strategic level, the Dnieper Carpathian offensive fundamentally altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe. It marked the near-total collapse of Axis positions in Ukraine, drove a wedge between German and Romanian forces, and opened a corridor toward the Balkans. The Carpathian Mountains, long seen as a natural barrier, were no longer a guarantee of security for the Axis. In their wake, the Soviets had reclaimed over 300,000 square kilometers of territory and inflicted more than 500,000 casualties on German-led forces. But even as the spring thaw slowed operations, Stavka began planning the next phase. With Romania vulnerable and Hungary increasingly unstable, Soviet strategists saw an opportunity to expand the war southward, to bring the Balkans into collapse, cut Germany off from its oil supplies, and force political realignments across Eastern Europe. The Dnieper Carpathian offensive had not just ended a chapter, it had set the stage for the next. The spring of 1944 brought not respite, but a reorientation of violence as Soviet forces redirected their momentum westward toward the Carpathian Mountains and the borderlands of Romania and Hungary. Having retaken most of Ukraine east of the Dniester River, the Red Army now turned to the final objective of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive, the liberation of the Carpathian region and the dismantling of German strategic depth in southeastern Europe. This final phase demanded not only continued operational endurance, but also adaptation to the entirely new challenge of mountain warfare, with its constraints on mechanized movement and supply. The First Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Zhukov, and the Second and Third Ukrainian Fronts, led by Konev and Malinovsky respectively, began converging toward the Carpathians by mid-April. The terrain transformed from vast open steppes to narrow passes, wooded ridges, and fortified river valleys. While the Germans had been retreating steadily since January, they saw the Carpathian region as a final bastion, a natural barrier that, if held, could stabilize the southern sector and protect the oil fields of Ploiesti and the Danube corridor. Consequently, the German High Command reinforced the area with remaining elements of the 1st Panzer Army, remnants of the 8th Army, and several Hungarian and Romanian divisions. The Soviet command responded with calculated pressure. Rather than relying on deep armored thrusts alone, they divided their forces into shock groups tailored for mountainous advance, infantry-heavy units with attached artillery, sappers, and mountaineers. Bridges were constructed under fire, horses and oxen were requisitioned for hauling artillery through mud-choked trails, and supplies were airdropped or sledged by local guides through remote passes. Despite extreme logistical constraints, the advance continued, driven by operational momentum and the high-level political aim of entering Axis-aligned territory before the Allies could open a new front in Europe. One of the most critical operations in this final phase was the Ternopil-Proskurov offensive, aimed at cutting off German retreat routes into the Carpathians. Soviet tank armies, still battle-hardened from the winter campaigns, conducted flanking movements toward Kolomyia and Chernivtsi, threatening to envelop Axis forces attempting to hold western Ukraine. The success of these maneuvers left entire German corps disoriented, forced into fighting retreats under constant air attacks, and vulnerable to encirclement in narrow mountain corridors where movement was slow and terrain offered little room to maneuver. As Soviet formations advanced into Bukovina and northern Bessarabia, they encountered a deteriorating Axis coalition. Romanian divisions, poorly equipped and suffering from collapsing morale, increasingly failed to hold their positions. Political instability within Romania exacerbated the military collapse. Public sentiment had turned against the war, and King Michael Lawlord's court was already seeking ways to exit the alliance with Germany. The Soviets exploited this weakness, using propaganda, radio broadcasts, and even dropped leaflets to encourage surrender and defection among Romanian troops. While the Red Army pushed through the Carpathian approaches, Soviet engineers and rear service units worked frantically to maintain the operational tempo. Bridges destroyed by retreating Axis forces had to be rebuilt within hours to avoid loss of momentum. Fuel had to be brought forward on narrow, unpaved roads, often under Luftwaffe harassment. Yet the Soviet advantage in manpower and resources, accumulated since the industrial shifts of 1942-1943, made it possible to sustain such effort. Every kilometer gained drew the front line closer to the Balkans, and every Axis defeat narrowed Germany's strategic options. Civilian life in these territories, once again caught in the tides of war, experienced profound disruption. Inhabitants of Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, already exposed to years of shifting authority and multiple occupations, faced renewed displacement, requisitions, and uncertainty. Many towns had seen control pass from Soviets to Germans and back again within 3 years. The returning Soviet administration brought renewed purges and mass arrests, particularly targeting suspected members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and those who had collaborated with Axis authorities or served in German-organized auxiliary units. The geopolitical consequences of the offensive were also beginning to crystallize. The collapse of German positions in Ukraine and the Soviet arrival at the doorstep of Romania put tremendous pressure on Axis-aligned governments throughout the region. In Hungary, political factions debated the possibility of a negotiated exit from the war. In Bulgaria, pro-German sentiment waned rapidly. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans received indirect support as Soviet successes encouraged resistance movements across the Balkans. The offensive, although limited geographically to Ukraine and the Carpathian Arc, thus had continental reverberations. As April turned to May, the final Axis strongholds in southwestern Ukraine, towns like Mukachevo, Uzhhorod, and Stryj, fell in rapid succession. These cities, deeply embedded in mountainous terrain, had been prepared for defense, but Soviet artillery and encirclement tactics rendered resistance short-lived. Hungarian and German units retreated across the border in disorder, leaving behind depots, prisoners, and abandoned fortifications. With the Carpathian passes secured, Soviet troops entered the historical region of Carpathian Ruthenia, effectively concluding the main phase of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive. By the end of the campaign, the Red Army had advanced over 500 kilometers in less than 4 months. Nearly all of Soviet Ukraine had been liberated, and a new front now opened in Central Europe. More than 20 Axis divisions had been destroyed, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers had been killed or captured, and entire logistical corridors lost to German control. The offensive also revealed a maturing Soviet military institution, capable of synchronizing multi-front operations, adapting to terrain, and sustaining prolonged offensives over diverse battlefields. Yet the human cost was staggering. Soviet casualties approached 1 million, with losses in both personnel and material significant despite the victory. Ukrainian villages were littered with the wreckage of tanks and the remains of fallen soldiers from both sides. Infrastructure lay in ruins, railways bombed, bridges shattered, and fields cratered. Reconstruction was still far away, but Soviet leaders saw in the rubble the foundations of a future empire stretching deep into Europe. With the Carpathians breached and Axis cohesion fractured, the strategic stage was now set for the great summer offensives that would carry the war into Poland, Romania, and the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Dnieper Carpathian offensive had not merely concluded the battle for Ukraine, it had opened the path to Berlin. The conclusion of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive in May 1944 marked not an end, but a transition, a pivot from the liberation of Soviet territory to a sustained drive into Axis-held Europe. Strategically, the campaign had erased nearly all German presence from Ukraine, reopened Soviet access to the Carpathians and the Balkans, and delivered a crippling blow to the Wehrmacht's Army Group South. Yet its broader significance lay in how it reshaped the military, political, and logistical dynamics of the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. From a military standpoint, the offensive confirmed the Red Army's evolution into a fully capable strategic force. No longer reliant solely on massed manpower and frontal assaults, Soviet commanders now executed large-scale encirclements, rapid pursuit operations, and flexible adaptation to terrain and weather. The campaign involved more than 2.3 million Soviet personnel, over 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. Its coordination across 4 Ukrainian fronts and hundreds of individual units demonstrated a level of command integration that had been unthinkable in 1941 or even early 1943. Equally critical was the collapse of German logistical coherence. The loss of Ukraine meant not only the retreat of frontline forces, but also the loss of critical industrial and agricultural resources that had sustained the German war machine. The manganese mines of Nikopol, the iron-rich region of Kryvyi Rog, and the Black Sea ports of Mykolaiv and Odessa were now in Soviet hands. The rail network that once allowed the Wehrmacht to move troops and supplies swiftly across the southern front was now destroyed, severed, or under Soviet control. Re-establishing lines of communication between Army Group North Ukraine and Army Group South Ukraine became a logistical nightmare for German planners. For the Germans, the defeat created a chain reaction of operational instability. Units retreating across the Carpathians did so in disarray, often without coordination with neighboring commands. Rearguard actions dissolved under the pressure of Soviet pursuit, and newly organized defensive lines proved temporary at best. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs led to repeated encirclements and the loss of experienced personnel. The German High Command increasingly found itself relying on understrength formations, foreign auxiliaries, and hastily conscripted Volksdeutsche units to plug gaps across the collapsing front. Meanwhile, the political impact of the offensive reverberated across southeastern Europe. In Romania, the monarchy and segments of the military leadership grew increasingly disillusioned with the German alliance. The Soviet approach to the Dniester and the partial occupation of Bessarabia reignited domestic opposition to the war. In Hungary, which had already begun secret talks with Western powers, the defeat of German forces in Ukraine confirmed that the Eastern Front could no longer be stabilized. The Axis alliance system was beginning to fragment, not through diplomatic collapse alone, but through battlefield erosion. Inside the Soviet Union, the offensive was heralded as a defining moment. Newspapers, newsreels, and political speeches celebrated the liberation of Ukraine and the destruction of fascist occupiers. Portraits of Zhukov, Konev, Malinovsky, and other front commanders appeared in propaganda materials, accompanied by glowing reports of Soviet heroism and unity. The offensive was used to reinforce internal cohesion, boost morale, and present the war as a righteous march of redemption and retribution. Cities such as Dnieper, Kherson, and Odessa were awarded the title of hero cities, embedding the narrative of patriotic resistance into the Soviet mythos. However, the NKVD and political authorities followed the military with equal determination. In each newly retaken region, mass arrests were conducted, aimed at eliminating potential nationalist movements, anti-Soviet partisans, and anyone suspected of collaboration with German occupation forces. In western and southwestern Ukraine, where Ukrainian nationalist movements like the UPA remained active, large-scale security operations intensified. Villages were depopulated, records purged, and entire communities resettled under suspicion of political unreliability. On the ground, for millions of civilians, the end of German occupation did not necessarily bring peace. Vast swaths of land were mined, housing was in ruins, and roads remained impassable due to combat damage or spring flooding. Agricultural production had ceased during the fighting, leaving local populations dependent on Red Army supply units or forced to forage for survival. Disease, hunger, and homelessness were widespread. Yet local labor was immediately mobilized by Soviet authorities to begin clearing rubble, rebuilding bridges, and restarting collective farms. This process, often driven by central directives and enforced by local party officials, became the first step in reimposing Stalinist governance. Internationally, the scale and success of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive shifted perceptions among the Allies. In London and Washington, military planners took note of the Red Army's growing operational reach and the speed with which it was reclaiming territory. The victory intensified Allied urgency to launch Operation Overlord, as there was growing concern that Soviet advances could, if unchecked, dominate all of Eastern and even parts of Central Europe before Anglo-American forces could establish a foothold on the continent. The offensive thus played a direct role in accelerating the opening of the Western Front. Moreover, the campaign demonstrated to Nazi Germany that defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was now taking shape on every strategic axis. Losses suffered by the Wehrmacht in Ukraine could not be replaced. Arms production, increasingly threatened by Allied bombing and dwindling access to resources, could not match the demands of continuous defeat. The morale of German troops plummeted as units were thrown into battle without proper rest, equipment, or hope of reinforcement. Deserter rates increased, and stories of Soviet reprisals, real or exaggerated, haunted retreating German formations. In terms of sheer geography, the campaign had redrawn the map of the Eastern Front. The German front line, once deep inside Soviet territory, had been pushed back to the gates of Eastern Europe. What had once been a war of penetration had now become one of containment. From the Carpathians to the Baltic, German forces were now on the defensive, while Soviet planning increasingly focused on how to cross national borders and penetrate Axis-aligned territory. The Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, therefore, was not merely the liberation of a region or the destruction of enemy armies. It was the strategic tipping point that redefined the shape, momentum, and political future of the war in the East. The Wehrmacht would never again mount a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative, now fully and irreversibly, belonged to the Red Army, and the Soviet Union, through fire and blood, had begun its long march into Europe. As the summer of 1944 approached, the consequences of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive continued to ripple across the strategic, political, and human landscapes of Eastern Europe. While the guns of the main campaign had fallen silent by May, the reconfiguration of the front, the disintegration of Axis cohesion, and the entrenchment of Soviet authority in newly recaptured territories formed the groundwork for the next stage of the war. The offensive, though concluded as an operation, had opened a corridor that now allowed the Red Army to project power beyond Soviet borders and into the heart of the Axis alliance. The operational aftermath was defined by an urgent realignment on the part of the Wehrmacht. The total collapse of Army Group South's positions in Ukraine had left the German southern front disjointed and exposed. In response, Hitler ordered the division of the front into two new army groups: Army Group North Ukraine, headquartered in southern Poland, and Army Group South Ukraine, tasked with holding the line in Romania and eastern Hungary. Yet these restructured commands were hollow formations, stitched together from exhausted remnants and foreign auxiliaries, their logistics fragmented and their morale shaken. Germany's Axis partners, especially Romania and Hungary, were now on the front lines. The losses incurred during the Soviet advance, particularly in Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, had undermined their political and military capacity. Romanian forces, battered by retreats and Soviet firepower, could not re-establish a coherent defense along the Prut or Dniester rivers. The Romanian High Command, led nominally by General Petre Dumitrescu, increasingly doubted German assurances and feared an imminent Soviet thrust toward the oil-rich region of Ploiesti. German reliance on Romanian territory, both for military defense and petroleum, created a dependency that the Soviets intended to exploit. The Soviet Stavka, recognizing this vulnerability, began preparing for an even broader strategic offensive into Romania. Intelligence operations, reconnaissance, and partisan contacts were intensified. Ethnic and political divisions within Axis-aligned states were carefully observed, and communist cells were activated in anticipation of coordinated uprisings or power shifts. These preparatory activities were a direct outgrowth of the successes achieved during the Dnieper-Carpathian campaign. The Soviets had not only cleared the field in Ukraine, but had demonstrated the ability to threaten the very foundation of Germany's alliance structure. In the territories left behind by the advancing front, reconstruction and retribution proceeded simultaneously. The NKVD, backed by the political departments of the Red Army, conducted extensive sweeps across western and southwestern Ukraine. Their targets were manifold: alleged collaborators, nationalist militants, former officials of German-backed administrations, and individuals who had avoided military service. Tens of thousands were arrested, interrogated, deported, or executed. The reintegration of these regions into the Soviet system was not left to chance. It was enforced through systematic repression and bureaucratic control. Mass arrests were accompanied by a campaign of political re-Sovietization. Schools reopened with revised curricula, emphasizing the heroism of the Red Army and the criminality of the occupiers. Newspapers were re-established under party oversight, and local Soviets were staffed by cadres loyal to Moscow. Collectivization resumed, sometimes forcibly, in regions where German occupation had allowed for partial land redistribution or independent peasant farming. Religious institutions, which had often enjoyed a measure of freedom under German rule, were once again placed under state surveillance or shut down entirely. In parallel, the Soviet propaganda machine worked to solidify the ideological interpretation of the campaign. The narrative emphasized liberation, fraternity among the Soviet peoples, and the restoration of historical justice. Public ceremonies were held in Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv to commemorate the return of Soviet power. Heroes of the offensive were awarded medals and featured in newsreels. While many civilians greeted the Red Army as liberators from Nazi brutality, others, especially in western Ukraine, feared the return of a regime they associated with repression, famine, and purges. The military toll of the campaign remained staggering. German losses exceeded 350,000 killed, wounded, or captured, while Romanian, Hungarian, and auxiliary forces suffered tens of thousands more. Soviet casualties were higher still, estimated at over 1 million, including more than 200,000 dead. The vast scale of the offensive, its rapid tempo, and the absence of stable front lines meant that entire divisions could vanish within days, cut off in forests or bogged down in failed crossings. The Ukrainian countryside bore the scars. Burnt-out tanks, mass graves, and shattered villages were visible reminders of the campaign's scale. Logistically, the Soviet Union faced immense challenges in stabilizing its rear lines. The advance had outpaced rail repairs, and supplies still had to be hauled over cratered roads or floated on river barges. Fuel shortages persisted, especially for mechanized units positioned near the Carpathians. Medical services were strained, with field hospitals overwhelmed and disease rampant among both soldiers and civilians. Yet even under these conditions, the Red Army continued to reform, resupply, and prepare for future offensives. New conscripts were trained in recently liberated areas, and factories in Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk were reactivated to support the next phase of war production. Diplomatically, the offensive's success strengthened the Soviet Union's hand among the Allies. Joseph Stalin, whose relationship with Churchill and Roosevelt had been marked by mutual distrust, now possessed undeniable leverage. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, Stalin had pressed for the opening of a second front. By the time of the offensive's conclusion, he could point to Soviet advances of hundreds of kilometers and the near-total collapse of Axis forces in Ukraine as evidence of the USSR bearing the brunt of the European war effort. This narrative resonated among Western leaders and set the tone for future negotiations over post-war Europe. At the same time, Soviet military planners were already looking beyond Romania and the Carpathians. The offensive had revealed that Germany's eastern defenses were hollowing out and that the time was ripe for further strategic exploitation. Operations were being considered against Slovakia, Hungary, and eventually Poland. The goal was not just to liberate additional territory, but to install Soviet-aligned regimes and ensure post-war political dominance. The war was evolving, no longer merely a battle to repel an invader, but a campaign to reshape the continent's future. Thus, The Dnieper Carpathian offensive, while militarily concluded, became the launch pad for the Soviet Union's transformation from a wounded power fighting for survival to a continental superpower projecting influence through both armies and ideology. The ashes of battle had yet to cool, but already the ground was shifting beneath Europe's feet. The war had entered a new phase, one not only of bullets and bayonets, but of borders and regimes. With the main phase of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive completed, the Soviet High Command turned its attention to consolidating gains and building the infrastructure necessary for further strategic expansion. The war had reached a point where each military victory required an equally vast administrative and logistical follow-up. Soviet forces, having advanced hundreds of kilometers across devastated terrain, now found themselves at the edge of new geopolitical realities. Ukraine was retaken, but what lay beyond, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, demanded not just continued offensive capability but political calculation, resource reallocation, and long-term occupation planning. The priority in the immediate aftermath was stabilization. The front, which had previously been fluid and expansive, had to be reinforced. Bridges destroyed by retreating Axis forces were rebuilt, and railways were rapidly repaired to extend the logistical arteries of the Red Army westward. Railway brigades worked around the clock, often under threat of German air raids or sabotage. Soviet engineers cleared mines from fields and roads, restored airfields in former German zones, and constructed forward supply depots at staggering speed. The intent was clear. There could be no pause. The offensive into Central Europe had to be continuous. The vastness of the regained territory introduced new complexities. The re-establishment of Soviet administrative control over millions of people required a mass mobilization of party cadres, internal security forces, and civil engineers. Commissars were dispatched to every major city and district to reinstate Communist Party rule, suppress dissent, and reintroduce state-controlled systems in education, agriculture, industry, and media. The reconstruction effort, though driven by genuine necessity, also functioned as a tool of ideological reimposition. Local resistance, whether overt or passive, was treated as counter-revolutionary sabotage. One of the critical challenges in this transitional phase was the status of Western Ukraine, particularly in Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. These regions had complex ethnic compositions and long histories of autonomy or non-Soviet governance. Here, anti-Soviet sentiment remained entrenched, fueled by both German propaganda during the occupation and indigenous nationalist aspirations. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, remained active in rural areas, executing ambushes on supply convoys and assassinating local party officials. The NKVD responded with escalating counterinsurgency operations, deploying tens of thousands of troops and implementing collective punishments on villages suspected of harboring insurgents. At the same time, demographic engineering began to take shape. Ethnic Poles were encouraged or coerced to relocate westward, often in exchange for land or housing confiscated from Germans in newly liberated Polish territories. Jewish survivors returning from hiding or from across the Soviet interior encountered a devastated community landscape. Entire shtetls had been erased, and anti-Semitic violence sometimes flared as displaced populations competed for scarce resources and housing. The state promised restitution and protection, but in practice, many survivors were left vulnerable to both administrative indifference and social hostility. Amid this social and political turbulence, the Red Army continued to undergo internal transformations. Units that had suffered devastating losses during the winter campaign were reinforced with new conscripts, many drawn from recently liberated areas. Some were volunteers, others were forcibly mobilized. The Soviet command viewed the replenishment of manpower as a necessary and non-negotiable element of continued victory. Medical commissions were often cursory, and exceptions rarely made. Men with barely healed wounds or those previously exempt from service were drafted into infantry units with little training. At the strategic level, the Red Army underwent a reorganization to prepare for upcoming operations. Entire formations were rotated, reassigned, or merged. Tank armies were re-equipped with improved T-34-85 models, and new artillery brigades arrived with heavier calibers designed to deal with the fortified defenses expected in Hungary and southern Poland. Air armies were concentrated in newly established bases in western Ukraine, within striking distance of enemy lines across the Carpathians and beyond. The goal was to achieve overwhelming superiority not just in manpower, but in firepower and tempo of operations. Concurrently, the Soviet Union began increasing its diplomatic and intelligence activities across the Balkans. Comintern agents and GRU operatives intensified contact with communist parties in Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, providing arms, training, and political guidance. The Yugoslav partisans under Tito were seen as particularly promising allies, capable of destabilizing German positions in the Western Balkans. In Romania, Soviet-aligned underground movements were encouraged to prepare for insurrection. Radio Moscow broadcast in local languages, presenting the Red Army as both liberator and guarantor of a new socialist order. This dual-track, military preparation and political subversion, reflected Stalin's larger vision. The Dnieper Carpathian offensive had eliminated the German presence in Soviet Ukraine, but Stalin's ambition extended further, to recast the political geography of Eastern Europe in the Soviet image. The Red Army was not merely to destroy fascism, it was to plant the roots of socialism in its place. Every step forward militarily was accompanied by steps toward political transformation, executed through propaganda, repression, co-optation, and structural control. Meanwhile, the German military, reeling from defeat, attempted to reorganize defensive positions in the Carpathians and along the Tisza River in Hungary. Fortifications were expanded around cities like Cluj, Debrecen, and Miskolc. New Waffen-SS divisions were transferred to the region, including those composed of ethnic Germans from the Balkans. Hitler insisted that these territories be held at all costs, aware that their loss would expose Central Europe and deprive the Reich of vital resources. Yet these measures did little to reverse the strategic imbalance. German units lacked the reserves, air cover, and logistical capacity to withstand sustained Soviet assault. The psychological dimension of the Soviet advance was also significant. The rapid succession of victories since the fall of Stalingrad had created a sense of invincibility within Soviet ranks. Propaganda posters, frontline newspapers, and political commissars reinforced the narrative of historical revenge and triumph. For soldiers, the advance into foreign territory marked a profound psychological shift, from defenders of the motherland to instruments of geopolitical retribution. This shift would have long-lasting implications for the conduct of troops, the policies of occupation, and the shape of post-war Soviet identity. Thus, in the summer of 1944, the legacy of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive was far from settled. It had broken the back of German defenses in the south, redefined the scope of the Soviet war effort, and initiated the irreversible projection of Soviet influence into Central and Southeastern Europe. What had started as a campaign of liberation had become a campaign of transformation. The Red Army stood not only at the edge of enemy territory, but at the threshold of empire. As the Soviet Union transitioned from the aftermath of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive into preparations for its next strategic thrust, the military, political, and social landscapes of Eastern Europe entered a volatile state of flux. The physical destruction of the German military in Ukraine had been profound, but equally critical was the ideological vacuum left in the wake of retreating Axis forces. The Soviets now faced the monumental task of controlling this void, preventing instability, and laying the groundwork for permanent influence in the region. Part 8 of this sequence of transformations would be shaped by the interaction of four forces: Soviet military consolidation, political re-engineering, intelligence activity, and the growing divergence between Allied strategic goals. One of the most pressing challenges was maintaining the military initiative without overstretching supply lines. The Red Army, which had covered hundreds of kilometers during the offensive, now found itself in urgent need of pause to rearm, resupply, and redeploy. Ammunition and food stocks had to be replenished from rear depots, still recovering from months of war. Railroads were extended westward, often over bombed or sabotaged tracks. Engineers, railway troops, and civilian labor teams toiled under harsh conditions to keep the supply routes functional. This logistical stabilization effort became the backbone of all subsequent operations into Romania, Hungary, and beyond. Simultaneously, Soviet military planning entered a new phase of complexity. No longer confined to defending national territory, Stavka was now coordinating multinational offensive operations across fluid borders, variable terrain, and in regions with ambiguous loyalties. Intelligence gathering took on new urgency. The GRU and NKVD expanded their presence in Romanian Bessarabia, Hungarian Carpatho-Ukraine, and northern Bukovina, recruiting informants, surveilling local leaders, and mapping the internal fault lines of Axis-aligned states. Each region had its own mixture of loyalties, histories, and political aspirations, which had to be understood and manipulated to ensure a smooth Soviet advance. Within the Red Army itself, new patterns of command were solidifying. Marshal Zhukov, General Konev, and Marshal Malinovsky emerged not only as tactical commanders, but as regional administrators in uniform. Their fronts oversaw vast swaths of territory, and their decisions shaped not just military outcomes, but the day-to-day governance of liberated zones. Front-level headquarters directed reconstruction, managed security, coordinated arrests, and interacted with local Soviet or pro-Soviet councils. This militarized form of civil governance, administered through field command structures, became a de facto model for how post-war Eastern Europe would be run under Soviet supervision. In parallel, the Soviet propaganda apparatus intensified its work to frame the Dnieper Carpathian offensive as part of a broader historical mission. Films, leaflets, and newspaper editorials glorified the Red Army's role not only as liberators from fascism, but as the vanguard of progress and justice. Slogans like, "We bring the light of freedom," were repeated across dozens of languages spoken in the occupied zones. Soviet radio broadcasts beamed into Romania and Hungary emphasized anti-fascist unity and the promise of a new social order. At the same time, Moscow encouraged the formation of national committees for liberation, shadow governments in waiting composed of communist exiles, partisans, or local sympathizers who could be installed once a region came under full Soviet control. Meanwhile, the civilian population across the borderlands struggled with disorientation and dread. The collapse of German authority, though welcomed by many who had suffered under occupation, did not automatically translate into trust in Soviet intentions. For those who had collaborated with Axis powers, willingly or under coercion, fears of reprisal were widespread. Landowners, clergy, local officials, and minority leaders all faced uncertain futures. The Red Army's arrival, often accompanied by summary executions, requisitions, and deportations, created a climate of apprehension that could not be masked by propaganda alone. In western Ukraine, guerrilla warfare escalated sharply. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which had reorganized in the face of both German withdrawal and Soviet return, launched coordinated attacks on supply columns, communication posts, and political administrators. The NKVD responded with brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. Bandit regions were cordoned off, and mass arrests were followed by public executions. Entire villages were razed on suspicion of harboring insurgents. The resulting cycle of violence entrenched a civil war within a world war, a localized but deeply entrenched conflict that would persist even after 1945. From a diplomatic standpoint, the Dnieper Carpathian offensive altered the conversations between the USSR and its Western allies. In private discussions between Churchill and Roosevelt, concerns began to surface about the scale and speed of Soviet advances. Though all parties remained formally committed to the defeat of Nazi Germany, it was increasingly clear that the post-war order would be shaped not just by military victory, but by who controlled what on the ground. Soviet dominance in Ukraine, Moldova, and parts of Romania gave Stalin a de facto veto over any political arrangement in those regions. The Western Allies also understood that their leverage was limited. While plans for the Normandy landings were underway, the Western Front did not yet exist. The Red Army was bearing the full weight of the European land war, and any pressure on Stalin to moderate his ambitions was tempered by the need for continued Soviet military pressure on Germany. This geopolitical reality created an emerging rift, one that would soon evolve into the defining division of the post-war era. But in mid-1944, that divergence remained masked by shared urgency and the illusion of consensus. Back on the ground, Soviet military planners focused on terrain and targets. The Carpathian passes had been cleared, but now came the challenge of open-field maneuver warfare across the Hungarian plains. Preparations for the Second Jassy-Kishinev offensive, the next major operation, were already underway. Reconnaissance teams scouted enemy lines south of the Dnieper. Artillery brigades were repositioned for massed barrages. Air support units were transferred to forward bases to provide close support during breakthrough phases. The shape of the next campaign was already visible, and the operational logic that had guided the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive would now be extended deep into Axis Europe. Thus, by the late summer of 1944, the legacy of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive was no longer confined to battlefields or command maps. It had become an engine of state transformation, a geopolitical lever, and a psychological turning point. For the Red Army, it had proven that offensive war on a continental scale was sustainable. For the Soviet Union, it had opened the door to post-war hegemony, and for the people of Eastern Europe, it signaled that the war was far from over, not merely a contest of nations, but a struggle over the future shape of society itself. The strategic consequences of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive continued to unfold long after the guns had fallen silent across the Ukrainian steppes and Carpathian passes. By mid-1944, the offensive had already been absorbed into the broader Soviet military doctrine as a model for future operations. It demonstrated the effectiveness of synchronized multi-front advances, the utility of deep penetration supported by encirclement, and the absolute necessity of combined arms integration at every level of combat. These tactical and operational lessons would soon inform the devastating Soviet victories in Romania and the Balkans, setting the precedent for how the Red Army would fight its way into the heart of Europe. But alongside these military insights, the offensive revealed and reinforced a set of darker, more opaque patterns. The use of mass repression as a tool of political stabilization, the strategic manipulation of local politics, and the transformation of liberated territories into laboratories for ideological and administrative control. The front had moved west, but the work of domination had only just begun. The Soviet system did not merely arrive with victory. It embedded itself through institutions, surveillance, and the quiet erasure of opposition. Among the most telling aspects of this transition were the rapid redeployments of Soviet internal security forces. NKVD units, once relegated to rear area policing, were now at the forefront of pacification. Mobile units of SMERSH, death to spies, tracked deserters, hunted nationalist guerrillas, and screened entire populations for loyalty. These operations were conducted with brutal efficiency: mass arrests, deportations to Siberia, and the establishment of filtration camps for soldiers and civilians alike. In western Ukraine and southern Moldova, whole villages were labeled as subversive and subject to deportation or forced resettlement. This was counterinsurgency in its most uncompromising form, military in form, but political in essence. Meanwhile, the Red Army's presence in newly secured territories had to be sustained and institutionalized. Garrisons were established in key towns. Military courts handled everything from looting to political offenses. Red Army newspapers and mobile cinemas spread the Soviet narrative, portraying the defeat of fascism as inseparable from the construction of socialism. These soft power instruments worked in tandem with the hard edge of military occupation to remold local consciousness. For many civilians, survival meant adaptation, learning the language of the new power, joining the local Soviet, or offering cautious support to party initiatives. A key tool in this political transformation was the reconstruction of local governments along Soviet lines. In formerly occupied Ukraine, especially in regions like Vinnytsia, Ternopil, and Chernivtsi, local Soviets were re-established under the close supervision of party organs. These were not autonomous entities. They operated as instruments of the central state, tasked with restoring agricultural production, implementing rationing systems, and identifying elements deemed politically unreliable. The re-Sovietization of public life was rapid and uncompromising. Former German administrators and police were arrested or executed. Schools reopened under Soviet curricula. Youth groups like the Komsomol re-emerged to cultivate a new generation of loyal citizens. In Romania, still nominally under German alliance, the consequences of the offensive were immediate and existential. Though the Red Army had not yet fully entered Romanian territory, its presence on the border and its demonstrated capacity to destroy Axis armies produced a political crisis in Bucharest. King Michael Brăban and elements of the Romanian elite began seeking exit strategies. Secret overtures were made to the Western Allies, and contingency plans were developed for a national coup. The very success of the Dnieper Carpathian campaign had triggered the erosion of Axis discipline from within. No longer could Germany rely on the loyalty of its satellite states. The writing was on the wall. Survival now meant realignment. In Budapest and Sofia, similar tremors could be felt. Hungarian leaders debated whether continued resistance was feasible given the enormous Soviet buildup along the Carpathian frontier. Bulgarian officials, while still formally neutral, began distancing themselves from Berlin, wary of Soviet retaliation. The strategic vacuum created by the Red Army's advance began pulling Axis states into political reconfiguration before a single Soviet soldier crossed their borders. This was geopolitical warfare by momentum. The sheer scale of Soviet victory reshaped regional alliances without the need for occupation. Yet, meanwhile in Moscow, the implications of the offensive were absorbed into long-term state planning. The State Defense Committee issued orders for the accelerated rebuilding of liberated industrial zones in Ukraine. Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kharkiv, cities decimated by war, were prioritized for reconstruction as centers of heavy industry. Thousands of skilled workers were transferred from the east. Factories reopened under state management, often repurposed for wartime production or future post-war demands. The Soviet war economy, flexible and centrally directed, could now draw upon Ukraine's resources once more, this time without German interference. Yet not all rebuilding was material. A cultural offensive accompanied the military one. Monuments to Soviet martyrs were erected in retaken cities. Memorial services commemorated both local and Red Army dead. Soviet cultural delegations arrived to stage plays, concerts, and political lectures. The message was clear. The Soviet return was permanent, righteous, and absolute. Ukrainian identity, where not fully subsumed by Soviet narratives, was carefully reinterpreted through the lens of pan-Soviet unity. Ukrainian language publications were allowed, but only those that adhered to ideological orthodoxy. Still, even amid these efforts, cracks persisted. In the countryside, resentment simmered. In the cities, shortages remained. The promise of peace clashed with the visible burdens of militarization. Many civilians continued to fear renewed deportations, fresh collectivization drives, or renewed purges. The war may have passed their villages, but its mechanisms remained embedded in their lives. For the Soviet state, however, these concerns were marginal. Stability had been achieved not through consent, but through control. And in the calculus of empire, that was enough. In military terms, the legacy of the offensive had also crystallized. German forces were no longer capable of holding strategic ground in the east. The loss of Ukraine had not only severed logistical arteries, but had permanently broken the Wehrmacht's southern spine. It would never recover. Future German defensive plans would now be reactive, fragmented, and built on terrain that no longer offered natural advantages. The Red Army, conversely, had proven that it could sustain long-term campaigns, adapt to complex terrain, and defeat experienced Axis formations in rapid succession. Thus, by the early autumn of 1944, the Dnieper Carpathian offensive had done more than shift the front. It had dismantled the military equilibrium in Eastern Europe, reshaped the political landscape of the Balkans, and hardened the ideological boundaries of the coming Cold War. What had started as a military operation to liberate Soviet territory had become a mechanism for Soviet expansionism. And behind every ruined German trench, every freshly raised Soviet flag, and every NKVD checkpoint, the next phase of European history was already taking form. As autumn deepened across Eastern Europe in 1944, the final reverberations of the Dnieper Carpathian offensive continued to shape the trajectory of the war and the structure of the emerging post-war world. What began in January as a Soviet campaign to reclaim occupied territory had ended, 10 months later, as a strategic earthquake that had redrawn the military, political, and psychological landscape of an entire region. Its final phase was not marked by dramatic offensives or major battles, but by the institutionalization of control, the codification of political transformation, and the silent preparation for the next stage of expansion. At the military level, the offensive had exhausted German capabilities in the southern theater. The Wehrmacht, reeling from continuous retreats, lacked both the manpower and the material to reconstitute its positions in Ukraine or along the Romanian frontier. Army Group South had effectively ceased to exist in its pre-1944 form, and what remained of its forces had either retreated into Transylvania and Hungary or been annihilated in pockets across western Ukraine and Bessarabia. The concept of a stable Eastern Front had become an illusion. Every German defense line was now a delaying tactic. Every reinforcement was a borrowed measure from collapsing fronts elsewhere. By contrast, the Red Army, though battered and bloodied, emerged from the campaign with restored confidence and hardened experience. Its commanders had learned how to plan and execute theater-scale operations with coordination, tempo, and overwhelming force. Logistics had become more mobile and mechanized forces more flexible. Artillery barrages were now synchronized with air power and infantry advances in a way that could overwhelm even the most fortified positions. Above all, Soviet strategy had shifted from territorial liberation to systemic penetration. The destruction of enemy coalitions, the reshaping of national boundaries, and the placement of loyal regimes in the path of its advance. The effects of this shift were felt most clearly in the immediate political transformations that followed. By the end of 1944, Romania had switched sides. The combination of military defeat, domestic unrest, and Soviet pressure culminated in a royal coup on August 23rd, which deposed the pro-German regime and placed Romania under a government willing to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. This marked the first major defection from the Axis camp since Italy and served as the clearest indicator of the offensive's strategic fallout. Soviet forces entered Bucharest not as invaders, but as arbiters of a new order. The occupation that followed was framed as liberation, but it bore all the traits of imperial extension. Hungary, too, was drawn into the orbit of collapse. Though it remained nominally aligned with Germany through much of 1944, the success of the Dnieper Carpathian campaign and the Soviet approach toward the Tisza River forced German forces to occupy Budapest preemptively, launching Operation Margaret to prevent a Hungarian defection. But the German hold was tenuous. As the Soviet advance reached the Hungarian plain, the Red Army was poised to begin the siege of Budapest, a final act of the Eastern Campaign that would mirror the scope and brutality of earlier victories in Ukraine. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the political shockwaves continued. In Bulgaria, a bloodless coup aligned the country with the USSR in September. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans moved in parallel with Soviet forces to reclaim territory and establish a new federalist communist regime. In Czechoslovakia, the exiled government in London began preparing for return under Soviet sponsorship. Each of these transformations was accelerated, if not outright enabled, by the strategic vacuum created by the offensive. The road westward had been opened by tanks, but it would be cemented by treaties, purges, and ideology. Within the Soviet Union, the victory was consecrated through ritual and rhetoric. Official histories declared the offensive a masterpiece of strategic art. Monuments were erected and anniversaries marked in the press. New medals were struck to commemorate the liberation of cities like Kherson, Nikolaev, and Odessa. Propaganda emphasized the ethnic unity of Soviet peoples, with Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, and others shown fighting side by side under the red banner. Yet behind this idealized narrative, the apparatus of control deepened. Political purges in the Red Army continued. Civilian populations remained under surveillance. The borderlands were not merely protected, they were absorbed. Economically, the Soviet state moved to integrate the reconquered territories into the wartime and post-war reconstruction apparatus. Thousands of tons of machinery, foodstuffs, and raw materials were requisitioned from Ukraine and redirected to support ongoing operations in the Balkans and Central Europe. Industrial plants were rebuilt or dismantled and sent east. Labor brigades, often composed of former prisoners or conscripts, worked in harsh conditions to restore transport corridors and rebuild shattered infrastructure. These reconstruction efforts, though brutal in pace and cost, ensured that the Red Army would maintain operational depth as it pushed further into enemy territory. In the West, Allied observers began to revise their assumptions. Reports from OSS and British intelligence analysts highlighted the scale of the Soviet advance, the entrenchment of political control, and the suppression of non-communist resistance movements. While the official Allied line continued to portray the USSR as a partner in victory, private memoranda increasingly spoke of a post-war divide. The seeds of the Cold War, mistrust, surveillance, political polarization, were already visible, sown in the very soil over which the Dnieper Carpathian offensive had passed. For those who had lived through the campaign, soldiers and civilians alike, the victory was total, but it was not uncomplicated. Entire cities had changed hands multiple times in 3 years. Families had been torn apart, farms burned, and communities decimated. The return of Soviet authority brought security for some, but fear and exile for others. Victory did not undo the scars of famine, deportation, or occupation. It imposed a new normal, one defined by silence, conformity, and survival under a victorious but authoritarian regime. In retrospect, the Dnieper Carpathian offensive was more than a military campaign. It was a geopolitical pivot. It marked the irreversible collapse of Nazi Germany's eastern bulwark and inaugurated the Soviet Union's transformation from a besieged nation to a continental superpower. It redefined warfare in the modern age, not only through tactics and logistics, but through the integration of ideology, statecraft, and force projection. It shaped the borders, governments, and memories of Europe for generations. When the last Soviet soldier crossed the Carpathians, the war had not ended, but the world had already changed. The line that separated liberation from occupation, ally from empire, had begun to blur. And in that gray zone, forged by steel and silence, the foundations of the post-war world were laid.